The US president made fresh promises of a better life in his State of the Union address. Obama pledged to combat financial inequality and lower taxes. Only he's facing a rapid decline in the amount the public actually trusts him to live up to his words. Recent polls show a third of the nation are pessimistic about the rest of Obama's term in office. And RT's Lucy Kafanov joins me now live for more on his latest State of the Union address. Hi there, Lucy. So what did Obama promise his audience this time around?
Well, a year of action. That was the rallying cry from the U.S. president at the State of the Union address here in Washington, D.C. But of course, it comes at a time when action is anything but guaranteed. It has been an incredibly difficult year for this administration. Obama is facing some of the lowest voter approval ratings of his presidency, a divided Congress that has almost halted his agenda to a complete stop. And so this year, we saw a president who seemed to acknowledge his limitations. He wasn't able to get through gun control measures he called for last year. Same goes for tax reform, climate change bills, immigration, closing Guantanamo. That list, of course, goes on. What the president promised to achieve, in fact, over the past few years simply hasn't come to be. And so we saw, instead of an ambitious new agenda, sort of much more moderate proposals trying to chip away on some of the problems he's been dealing with for a while. For example, unemployment, middle class insecurity, problems with education, and so forth. We also saw Obama trying to assert himself, or trying to at least, by sidestepping Congress on several issues. For example, he did promise to use his executive power to raise the federal minimum wage for federal contract workers. But on the big ticket items, his hands really are tied. He needs Congress to do things like immigration overhaul of the tax code and immigration reform. He's not likely to get that kind of support on Capitol Hill. And so whether those promises will be achieved really remains to be seen. On foreign policy, quite light on that angle. Obama did point out that he's made good on his promise of bringing troops home from Iraq. On Afghanistan, however, he did seem to leave the door open yet again to keeping a small force of Americans on the ground. This even as America's longest war is scheduled to come to an end. He did acknowledge the rise and spread of al-Qaeda in Yemen, Somalia, Mali, Iraq, and also said that large-scale deployments, that is, boots on the ground, really is not a policy that works. Well, of course, the administration's response to that, using drone strikes, for instance, and expanding the NSA surveillance measures, have been severely criticized. He did seem to get at that very briefly in a speech by reminding viewers that he has imposed limits on the use of drones and promised again to reform U.S. surveillance, but no details on how to actually make those words, those promises, into real action. I should also say that Obama did mention Ukraine in light of the unrest that's going on in that country. He did say that the U.S. stands with the principle that all people have their right to express themselves freely and peacefully and have a say in their country's future, really coming out on the side of the protesters there, as we've seen from the administration in recent weeks. Back to you in Moscow.
Thank you very much. RT's Lucy Kafanov in Washington. Lucy, thank you. And for more on Obama's proposed reforms, we're now joined live by Eugene Poirier from the social justice group, the Answer Coalition. Eugene, welcome to RT. Nice to see you here. So at the center of Mr. Obama's speech were economic reforms like lowering tax, raising wages, improvement of conditions for the working class. Does the U.S. have enough funds to deliver on all that?
Well, I don't think they have the real ability to deliver on all that. And we've seen so far, and this is why people don't believe it, is Obama continually touting a lower unemployment rate. But in fact, we've seen with the employment and population ratio, the unemployment rate has barely moved in 5 years. Primarily, he's discussing issues of the minimum wage, which, of course, any rise is welcome for workers. But, by and large, when he's talking about families living in poverty, what's being proposed by President Obama and Congress in terms of the minimum wage isn't enough. And beyond that, he's begging businesses to invest, but it's contradictory because businesses in the United States are continually saying they want lower wages, they want less secure pensions, they want all these sorts of non-union restrictions in order to create jobs. So his desire to say, oh, well, we're going to create more jobs and we want to improve the lives of workers are really, in fact, contradictory. And so certainly I think this is why we see the American people less willing to believe their representatives, whether it's the president or Congress.
We know that Obama is facing a serious decline in his popularity among the people. Do you think this speech, this address, will change anything to improve that?
I don't think it will, because I think people know that in the United States, in election years is the #1 time politicians promise things, but they don't do much of anything. And certainly we've seen, and I saw this reported ahead of time, that people since 2004 almost uniformly have continued to view the country as going on the wrong direction. So I don't think speeches really are going to transform significantly how people view things. I think President Obama is certainly trying to put a good spin on things, but I doubt outside of his hardcore supporters he's going to do very much. And I think conditions in the country will probably continue to erode people's confidence in the ability of the Congress and the president to govern.
Last year, Congress ignored actually Obama's calls for new gun controls, for new job program, immigration reform. Could we see more frustrating gridlock this year?
I think we will see that, because in an election year, we'll see both parties attempting to speak to their base about what they wish they could do if they were elected, which means that they'll move further apart in terms of what they're actually trying to propose, and be less likely, I think, to compromise, which is why I believe they passed a budget deal already, so they have a bit of a truce going into this election year. I think we will see more gridlock. This is a country where the congressional districts are essentially gerrymandered, so people are really in districts where the people they're speaking to really already support them, so they have very little incentive to reach across the aisle and make these sorts of deals. So I think we'll continue to see that Congress and the president will find that what they say, what the American people want, which is an improvement in their living standards, is really at odds with what Congress is willing to do, because we know that politics in America is determined by big business. And as I mentioned earlier, their real imperatives certainly conflict with what the average working class American really needs.
Talking about the NSA spy scandal haunted Mr. Obama over the last year, but he didn't mention anything about it this time around. Why do you think is that?
Well, I think he didn't mention anything because his case is so incredibly weak. At almost every single stage, the disclosures by Edward Snowden have proved that the government is essentially lying about their capabilities. And of course, we know that James Clapper lied, in fact, in front of Congress. And so I think the credibility of the United States on this issue, of the NSA issue, is extremely low. And we've seen that every single claim, from whether it's collecting location data to the metadata issue to whether Americans' data is actually able to be monitored, all these things, the government has said one thing, then it's been proven another thing. And I think that the president knew that he should just, completely try to gloss over this as much as he possibly could, because I don't think anyone believes anything the government says on this issue, and their credibility is completely shot. They've shredded the constitutional rights of Americans and lied about it, and I think they didn't want to bring attention to that.
Eugene, and very briefly, if you can, the American president claims that, quote, no other country in the world does what we do. Is he once again back on his U.S. exceptionalism hobby horse? What do you think?
Oh, I think he most certainly is, although he is right on the one hand, because no one does what the United States does in terms of spying on the people of the world, launching drone strikes and other military actions and things of that nature, and attempting to dominate the world with this massive military machine in an unprecedented fashion. So on that sense, he's right. And his attempt to whip up the American patriotism by saying we're the greatest country to the exclusion of all others, I think is odious. And I don't think it's something that will bring more cooperation amongst the peoples of the world.
Eugene Burier from the Answer Coalition, thank you very much indeed for your time.